But first, let's turn to a problem that arguably doesn't receive nearly enough international attention, the worsening crisis in Yemen. It's on the brink of the worst famine the world has seen in decades, yet it faces a drastic shortfall in international funding. Meanwhile, violence has been escalating as the war's about to drag into its 7th year. It is a dire situation. There is a chance, though, that a new US administration could bring renewed momentum for a breakthrough. So to discuss what's underway, I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Dr. Elisabeth Kendall, who's a senior research fellow at Oxford University's Pembroke College and an expert on Yemen and jihadist movements. Welcome to Saturday Extra.
Thank you. Good morning.
Would you mind giving us an update, please, on the humanitarian situation in Yemen, please?
Yes, sure. It is, as you say, extremely dire. Even before the war, Yemen was the poorest country in the Arab world, but it's also very populous. It's got about 30 million people. About half of them are under the age of 18. And 80% of them, so that's 24 million, live below the poverty line now. They need some kind of aid or assistance. Over 16 million are going to go hungry this year. And you've talked about famine, and we hear a lot about famine-like conditions in Yemen. We see lots of pictures of starving children crossing our screens, but a famine can't actually be officially declared because accessing the data is so difficult. We can't get the data to prove it. And it's not really just the famine and the starvation itself. There are all sorts of elements that go with that. There's economic collapse, there's disease, cholera, dengue fever, diphtheria, not to mention COVID. There are locusts, there have been floods this year, there's water shortage, a fuel crisis, and a health system in collapse. So it really is so disappointing that the United Nations Pledging Conference that was held a couple of weeks ago only didn't even reach half of the 4 billion that's needed to stave off this catastrophe.
Why do you think this has all gone under the radar for so long? Might it be because Yemen's millions of refugees are internally displaced and we don't see them making their way to the shores of Greece and Italy?
Well, that's definitely one element of it. Yes, they're out of sight, out of mind. Other conflicts in the region, like, say, Syria or Libya, of course, they're right on the shores of the Mediterranean, and so they show up in Europe. We see them, they're before us, whereas Yemen just seems a bit further removed. I also think maybe one element is that there's no easy narrative of good guys and bad guys. It's not an easy story to tell. It's quite complicated. There are multi-layers to the conflict. And there are so many aspects, it's just hard to know where to begin, Geraldine. Do you start with the disaster, the health crisis, the terrorism, the trafficking?
Yes. I must say, in reading about it, I thought, how are we going to summarise this for the listeners? It is quite complicated. You say you believe there are, strong moral and geopolitical reasons for the international community to pay more attention and to help in finding a solution. Could you outline those, please? Maybe in some sort of order of importance.
Yes. Well, I think from what I've mentioned so far, the moral imperative is probably clear to your listeners, helping to prevent millions of people from starving. We have a moral responsibility there. But also, I guess there's also a moral responsibility for many countries in the West because we've indirectly profited from the war. In the UK, for example, it's estimated that we've authorised about $9 billion of arms sales to Saudi since the war began. And Saudi is a major combatant now in Yemen. But geopolitically, well, I guess the location of Yemen speaks for itself. It's got 2,000 kilometres of coastline, so it's incredibly important for maritime security and commercial shipping. And it controls that access called the Bab el-Mandab, that all-important access to the Red Sea through which oil tankers pass. So the last thing we want geopolitically in our own interests is for the conflict to spill over in the region.
And just taking a step back, could you remind us what the political situation is in Yemen at the moment? Because we're essentially looking at a three-pronged war within a war, aren't we?
Yes. You could identify three main power blocks. So this is putting it probably very generally, but the first one would be the rebels who took over the country at the end of 2014, or much of the country. And they're known as the Houthis. They're based in the capital, Sana'a, and they're backed by the international power, regional power, Iran. Then we have a second layer, which is the Saudi-backed internationally recognised government. And until recently, that was based in Riyadh. And then we have a third power bloc. These are southern separatists who are based in Aden, and they're backed by the UAE. Now, just to bring it up to date, very recently, those last two power blocs, the internationally recognised government and the separatists, have joined forces and formed a power-sharing government. So it's still a very uneasy alliance between them. So we've got 2 to 3 power blocs. Each of them really run out of a separate capital, and each of them backed by a different regional power.
Goodness me. Actually, that's a good job of describing it, though. And then, would it be fair to say that the Houthis too are sort of, as I think the Financial Times described them recently, as a battle-hardened Islamist movement? Is that an extra bit of description we need?
Well, battle-hardened, definitely. A supremacist Islamist movements of sorts, yes. But I'd like to stress that this wasn't always the case. The Houthis have had many grievances for decades. They were politically marginalised, economically marginalised, and, yes, eventually radicalised. But when they swept to power, they had genuine grievances, and they've become much more difficult to deal with and potentially impossible to reconcile with since then.
What do you see as some possible solutions or the steps that need to be taken to start solving the crisis? Because I also read that there has been quite an escalation of conflict just of late. So, the time is ripe for something.
It is. And we're seeing the new Biden administration in the USA start to try to take this on, actually. The new Biden administration immediately went out and appointed a special envoy to Yemen, so that shows how seriously they're taking it. They also withdrew support for Saudi offensive operations over Yemen, and that's been important because actually of over 22,000 air raids done by the Saudi coalition over Yemen, only about a third of them hit military targets, for sure. So that definitely needed to be reined in. But it's not going to be enough just to try to put pressure on the Saudi-led coalition. We also need to find a way of peeling off the moderates from the hardliners on the rebel Houthi side. And that might be done by trying to understand local dynamics well enough to figure out how to peel off their supporting militias. And then also linking economic support to political outcomes, making economic support contingent on transparency and accountability. And then perhaps finally, better inclusion. At the moment, it's quite often the same old voices coming to the fore, the same old elites, the same old faces going to the peace talks when they do from time to time happen. And we need much better inclusivity, much more diverse voices from Yemen, if ever an agreement's going to be rolled out on the ground.
Could Iran be drawn into this? I mean, if there's a sort of a great effort to try to resuscitate the Iran deal with the US, the JCPOA, could they show their bona fides? I mean, I know that's slightly an odd question given what else they're involved in around the region, but could they be drawn in to do exactly what you're suggesting?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And for sure, the hope is there that on the side of the Americans and the United Nations, that Iran can be persuaded to play its part on bringing about peace. Now, at the beginning of this war, Iran was tangentially engaged. It did a lot of saber rattling, but actually the Houthis were already awash with weapons. During the course of the war, Iran's supply of weapons and advisors has dramatically escalated. So it would be a huge help if it were to stop supplying the Houthis with weapons and advisors. And we did actually see the special envoy visit Iran in February. So that's the UN special envoy. So definitely there are talks going on with Iran.
Now, of course, the Americans, President Biden has said all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen will stop. It's something the UK and Australia neither have said, have they?
No, they haven't. But there was, for example, a statement that came out yesterday from the UK Foreign Office and some European partners, Germany, France, Italy, as well as the USA, that said, we are renewing our diplomatic efforts to really try to bring this conflict to an end. And I guess that, just to sum up, needs to happen on three levels. The international community needs to put the kind of pressure that was spoken about in that statement on its regional partners. Regional players, that's Saudi, UAE, Iran, especially, need to try to rein in their proxies on the ground. And ultimately, it's the domestic players who are going to have to solve this, because that's how the war was originally generated, domestically. Just
to end on a bit of hope, I gather you've been involved in one rather interesting grassroots project, trying to start a women's newspaper in the far east of Yemen. Can we end on a bit of hope?
Oh, yes, that's right. Thank you for raising that. Yes, I think women have an enormously positive role to play in bringing an end to the conflict in Yemen. And it was so surprising to go to Yemen and to meet these women who are so keen to have their voices heard. Although I have to say, one of the first things they said to me was, we don't want to be like you, which surprised me and also delighted me. It's good. They have their own voice. They've got their own way of doing things. And just trying to help build confidence by enterprises like launching a women's newspaper, it's just, little steps. Little steps can go a long way.
Indeed, I couldn't agree with you more. Well, good luck, and thank you very much indeed for explaining that so well.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for asking.
Dr. Elisabeth Kendall, Senior Research Fellow at Oxford University's Pembroke College.